So welcome to this paper session. We have two presenters. Our first presenter's topic is Hope, Charity, Empathy, and What We Can Learn from St. Paraskeva. Our presenter is Mariana Cuceu, is that how you say it? Who's a physician, also has a master's in public health, and is a PhD candidate. She's an affiliate with the Program on Medicine and Religion at the University of Chicago, and she's a member of Saints Constantine and Helen Romanian Orthodox Cathedral here in Chicago. We welcome you, Mariana, for your paper. And just so you all know, the format is a 20-minute paper, and then there's time for questions, and then we'll move to the next paper. Does that make sense? And we have a little more flexibility. We have lots of questions because it's two presenters, not three, as you see. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. So it's always a blessing for me to be here to present on this work that I'm doing on empathy, which is my theme of dissertation, of PhD dissertation. And I can say that my attachment to OCAMPR, it's also an emotional attachment, as I was able to first express my intentions in working on this area, first time in this type of settings and conference. And the second was the second big component of my inspiration in this is the Program on Medicine and Religion at the University of Chicago, which was both events or departments, so to speak, have been contributing significantly to my organization, to my growth as a speaker. I did not know how to present in the beginning, and I just find myself in this path of learning how to speak publicly and how to become in these conferences, and I cannot acquire that more than that's a blessing that I've been provided with. So I look forward to present to you one of the papers that I wrote on Saint Paraskeva and the way how I feel that Saint Paraskeva has been fostering my formation as a more empathic caretaker, representative of the care system, so to speak. And then, if briefly remains time in the time of discussions that we have available, because I will read my paper, which talks about these theoretical cognitive premises that I'm putting together. But then I would like to briefly bring to your attention the other part of my work, which is the practical applicability of this, which rests on the charity work that I do under St. Paraskeva Orthodox Charity that I co-founded and lead 9 years ago, reaching 10 years anniversary. So that has been a profound transformation of myself in this work that I identify myself. So these pieces are coming together, so I kind of look forward to share both parts of this if time permitted. So, October 14 is the feast day of Saint Paraskeva of Epivat, also known as Saint Paraskeva of the Balkans, a highly honored figure within the Romanian, Greek, Bulgarian, and Serbian Orthodox communities. According to Orthodox tradition, Saint Paraskeva lived her earthly life in the first half of the 11th century, and she's known for her commitment and sensitivity to the needs of the poor, particularly orphan and children. Saint Paraskeva's movement toward charity and the poor began not from a philanthropic disposition or a humanitarian call, but from an encounter with the transcendent, the beauty and the truth captured in the work of religious architecture and iconography. Overwhelmed by the beauty of the Church of Saint Theophan and the relics housed there, Paraskeva left her life of relative wealth and affluence to walk the life of a mendicant, embodying prayer, fasting, asceticism, and miracles that are celebrated in the communities of faith even today. It was the 19th century Russian novelist Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky who made the famously prophetic claim that beauty will save the world. Dostoevsky was not referring to something physically attractive or pretty, but rather beauty as that which is centered in goodness. And for Dostoevsky, the hunger for Kalon, the good and the beautiful, is the catalyst that initiates a life of not only empathy, but charity, which is a practical virtue. A powerful reflection on the source of such goodness, beauty, and saving is found in the lives of religious figures like Saint Paraskeva. The conversion from beauty to charity, which Saint Paraskeva is known for, are a lens for how beauty might move the healthcare practitioner or the caretaker past diminished forms of empathy to charity, from compassion at a distance to compassion in an instant. Indeed, for many Orthodox communities, saints are open windows by which all humans might consider themselves and their work. They are occasions for learning, regardless of tradition, spirituality, or belief. Paraskeva, her encounter with beauty and her life of charity have something to say to the medical practitioner today regarding that important contemporary word in medical formation, which we call empathy. Empathy has become a buzzword in modern medicine. In the conversation around burnout and the now infamous hidden curriculum, conversations and commentary turn often on themes of recovering empathy or maintaining it. And yet, it isn't always clear what educators mean by empathy in medical training. The virtue philosopher McIntyre makes the claim in After Virtue, which contextualizes this lack of clarity, namely that modern society has inherited a moral vocabulary divorced from the traditions and communities that made moral content meaningful, and thus modern society often uses words with moral import that it no longer understands the origin, context, or the true meaning of. Ryan Batzler makes a similar claim in his recent work, which questions the clarity and aims of empathy in medicine. Batzler asks a McIntyrean question. When we speak of empathy, do we really know what it is we're talking about? Empathy remains a key component of professionalism in patient care and medical education, and clearly is an important concept contributing to both formation and clinical practice of medical practitioners. It is known that empathetic behavior likely leads to better patient satisfaction, diagnostic accuracy, illness-specific information, patient participation, patient education, compliance enablement, reduced stress, and increased quality of life. And while we know that there is a significant empathy decline when medical students enter clinical training, the outlook appears positive as renewed focuses on empathy interventions and developing and working to foster and increase empathy in medical training. And yet, empathy education has come under scrutiny. Like Plato's great question, can virtue be taught? Many thinkers and educators wonder what virtue formation, wisdom curriculum, and empathy formation might look like for the medical trainee, and question if such training is really feasible. Practitioners might wonder whether empathy decay is greatly over-exaggerated, just as they might question whether empathy is even practical. Empathy is critiqued, being a moniker for niceness, and empathy interventions depend on considerable time and limitless stores of altruism. While the training of healthcare professionals is focusing primarily on acquiring technical knowledge and skills that are primarily addressing the treatment of the disease, the journey of the future clinical practitioner is facing a painful reality, that of being mostly unprepared to withstand the illness, dying, and suffering in mostly every form. Clinical empathy decline has been fervently researched, while empathy is recognized as being essential not only to quality of care but also to patient adherence to treatment. While clinicians are challenged by the most emotionally distressing situations on a daily basis, the understanding of how empathy can be preserved remains even more critical in a disease-oriented model of care that focuses on details of disease rather than person that suffers. Researchers are reporting high prevalence of distress and a significant decrease in altruistic behavior among U.S. medical students. Consequently, critical questions are raised regarding the interpersonal sensitivity and overall caregiving behavior and what tools of training and formation for clinical staff are necessary to rescue and restore our clinicians. Yet, we are still missing a very clear agreement of what the construct of empathy is. There is some sense of agreement that empathy encompasses complex emotional and social abilities with sophisticated and complex interaction at the neurohormonal components. Singer and collaborators in 2009 view empathy as the process by which one interfered the affective state of the other person by experiencing a similar state in oneself, but keeping a distinction between self and the other. Further, Dicity and collaborators concluded that a complete overlap between self and other representation results in distress and could be detrimental to the empathic ability by hampering the ability between self and other perspective. This is Dicity's standpoint, a long-standing social researcher in this field. Both the legitimacy of what empathy seems to capture but the confusion over what exactly it is, combined with the ambivalence of some to embrace a word that has come to lack practical particularity, has led some philosophers to conclude that it isn't more empathy that medicine needs, but rather compassion and curiosity. Curiosity, as a corollary to compassion, is intentional questioning with humility, focus on the patient's well-being, and journey towards health. As Jody Halpern puts it, Jody Halpern is a psychiatrist with a significant contribution to the field of empathy, and she wrote extensively on this area. So Jody Halpern puts it, if we long for applicable, actionable empathy, sometimes that she calls effectively engaged curiosity. On the other hand, compassion from compassion or co-suffering harkens to the image of Job's friends in Job 2:13, who in a time of great suffering sat on the ground with him. On top of these suggestions for compassion and curiosity, we propose the addition of the word charity and highlight how charity and beauty can be learned from the witness of a Christian Orthodox saint. We would also like to infer that the concept of self-other differentiation with respect to empathy should be further addressed, and its understanding should not be limited to neurobiological mechanism. The anatomical view simply undermines the complex understanding of the human person that has been created in the image and likeness of God. Ultimately, empathy is perceived as essential to survival of all created living species. The example, now I'm going to introduce a concept which I'm developing in my PhD thesis, which is called ascetical empathy, and parallel this with the concept of charity. The example of Saint Paraskeva advances a model that in many ways differs from all those mentioned above, a model of empathy best called ascetical. This ascetical empathy is performed in obedience to the resurrected Christ, who remains the perfect model of empathy of all times, the ascetic with capital A. In this presentation, we are further going to reflect on the model of ascetical empathy, and we also reflect on how Saint Paraskeva, through her ascetic life and charitable action, dissipates the distance between self and the other by self-emptying and through unifying herself with Christ. Ascetical empathy, therefore, is the process of self-emptying or kenosis that allows the appropriation of the life of another. It is in this process that St. Paul reminds us in Philippians 2:5-8 to find the incarnation of Christ. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of bondservant and coming in the likeness of man. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Philippians 2:5-8. The incarnation of Christ through kenosis is the example of ultimate empathy of God and his wounded creation. At the heart of the ascetical empathy model stands the concept of charity. Yet understandably, this concept plays little to no role in modern medical discourse. Rarely do we hear the words like charity. This is understandable. The word charity can ring a bit of archaic moralism, anachronistic or antiquated. But this may be exactly why medicine might consider recapturing the word. Orthodox Father Silvio Bunta argues that in contemporary times, we're living in a world of much empathy but little charity. We are masters of what we call compassion at a distance, a compassion and empathy conveyed through a screen, Facebook, you name it, all these virtual type of things, or kept internalized in a sentimentality, rather than in embodied physical action within the word. For Father Bunta, one might empathize with the poor quite well, but remain uncharitable. It is the act of physically engaging your clothes with someone in need, like Saint Paraskeva did even as a child, that constitutes the robust vision of charity offered by Greek Orthodox thought as well as many other religions. Charity depends on embodied action in personal presence and specific instances. As Bunta writes, naturally, when it comes to ourselves being in need, we would desire action and not a distant and disengaged sense of goodness in our fellow human beings. You know the sentence, I hope you're going to go through this. You can make it, when we tell the others, you can make this. Is this really what the other what that person really wants to hear? This is what Bunta talks about. Yeah, I know you can make this, But many times we find ourselves saying that, right? Fellow human beings, so also other needs can only be met by action. To put it bluntly, no one can be charitable from a distance. Within medicine, then, the discussions around empathy might bear the same marks. For one can imagine being quite empathetic towards a patient, but not actually acting out in physical, practical action towards them. For the ability to understand and even share feelings with a patient over suffering in no way demands or even necessarily includes sitting with, being with, holding, touching, or comforting the patient. Clearly, empathy might lead to those actions, but those actions are captured more by the moniker of charity. The empathetic physician might feel these patients' pain and thus move towards them, but it is in the embodied movement towards the one in need that constitutes the charitable action. In Orthodox theology, charity is perceived as a virtue. The state of charity, the virtue, needs to be distinguished from the manifestation of charity. There is a very important dilution or disappearance between these two stages through asceticism. There is a fundamental difference between what constitutes secular ethics or confirmation and obeying to a set of precepts understood as coming through human reason and discourse alone, versus asceticism, a model of Christian life that is centered on the conformity to a life of virtue through obedience to revealed precepts and their living understanding in the new times and place. In the contemporary moment, as it moves forward always, the precepts are fulfilling, meaning discerned, understood, and acted upon in the Spirit of Christ, rather than being descriptively accomplished, as in following a set of directions and instructions. This contemporary response over what can be understood as an archaic following of precepts has a unitive reality in the person living out this life, which is a model that forms a central language in reality of transformation, deification, and charity, love. The ultimate result is the molding of an interior life in such a way that Christ, the example of all love and all charity, lives inside of us as a reality of the Spirit, not as a prescriptive fulfillment of precepts and instructions. That is the change that will help attain the ascetic empathy, and the change that we are all seek through our ascetic lives, that is remarkably depicted by Paul in Galatians 3:7. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. Therefore, Saint Paraskeva remains what she was and what she is for the last 1,000 of years, is not by being ethical or simply obeying the Christian commandments, but through her embodiment of Christ by self-emptying in order to receive the resurrected Saviors, and by embodying his humbling embracement to all those suffering. The context here is one of asceticism, in which one is transformed in Christ. In this model, what collapses is exteriority itself, exteriority between oneself and Christ first, and foremost and then, and subsequently between oneself and the others and all others. For a saint, there is no distance between oneself and the other. They remain charitable through the experience of the reality that all are one in Christ. Yet true charity means that the charitable act is done from within, which leads the journey to the disappearance of the distance between the self and the other. Saint Paraskeva felt empathy for the poor, and she then moved from within toward that need, and most concrete in the physical action of charitable response to alleviate that need. Paraskeva's prayers in front of God offers the ascetical empathy to all those in need that are seeking her intercessions for almost 1,000 years. What is intriguing about Saint Paraskeva's story is the role that beauty played in moving her to the life of charity. We find that consideration of beauty, connection to empathy formation, might be compelling for medical practitioners and educators to consider. Beauty and charity. Ethics ought to be the aesthetics of behavior, so writes aphorist Nicolas Gomez Davila. His quick capture to the philosopher's suggestion that beauty and goodness are fundamentally identical. Indeed, the very word the Greeks had for beauty, kanon, means the good and the beautiful. According to Orthodox theology, the aesthetic character is one of the most profound features of being. It is the transcendental force that penetrates and assimilates the layers of one's faith in God. Beauty, therefore, is not simply in the eye of the beholder. It becomes true beauty when oriented towards God, as it is from God and can't be separated by Him. And when it moves away from God, it remains ugly. It is this true beauty that Saint Paraskeva inspires into millions of international pilgrims for almost 1,000 years in their struggle to understand the beauty of creation and their surroundings. But for the Greek Orthodox theologian, in order to see or understand this beauty, we need to be merciful. And here is where goodness and beauty come side by side. Paraskeva, as a little girl, once offered her gold necklace to a poor girl on the street while being admonished by a servant, her servant. She comes from a rich family, well-established financial family, the servant told her she was doing something wrong. Little Paraskeva at that little age replied, "It is the cross which told us to be merciful. Could my jewelry, which is beauty, not be used as charity for this poor girl who does not deserve such a hard life in the society ruled by Christ?" Because of beauty, participatory quality, and connections to the good, beauty invites a desire for a moral action in the world, precisely because it is not disinterested in the infamous language which the philosopher Immanuel Kant ascribed to beauty. Truth can't be disinterested in the sense that it can be observed in the sterile, neutral observation. True beauty tends to demand something from the viewer. In fact, words such as prosphios and kalos, found in the Christian sacred text, that carry an aesthetic component, are also present into moral duty. Beauty is not a mere waiting of ugly things to mend, so much as a call to help mend them, like a surgeon moving to reopen an infected wound, or a saint exchanging clothes with a poor girl and dressing that ripped cloth back on the saint's body, like Saint Paraskeva did many times as a child. The medical humanities function best when they move us beyond compassionate distance or sterile, cerebral empathy to something like embodied, participatory charity. Perhaps no one has said this better than philosopher Ellen Scarry in her appropriately titled book on beauty and being just. Beauty actually assists us in the work of addressing injustice, requiring of us constant perceptual acuity, high dives of seeing, hearing, touching. Platos required that we move from eros, in which we are seized by the beauty of one person, to caritas, in which our care is extended to all people. The medical practitioner might be moved from the beauty of a single experience to the care of the suffering around them, beyond compassionate distance, to the good and local work of the charity. It is the self-emptying that sustains the inner silence of ascesis, that gives the hope, the strength, and transforms the caregivers as they strive to listen and respond to the suffering of others. So now, that was my theoretical argument. And then, if permitted, I would like to do a practical introspection briefly on the practical aspects of, to share with the audience. For me, I learned the charity as I was doing it. my connection, I say my connection to Saint Paraskeva happened in an instance, exactly how I write, how it's written in this paper. And I truly believe now, we're reaching 10 years now of this charitable work. As I walk 10 years side by side with the charitable work of this saint, which I claim it's her work. It's not my work. It truly is her work. I'm just a servant that chooses to answer to this call and chooses to say, here I am. I'm going to do this. I'm going to continue to do this. I think Saint Paraskeva and all the saints are open windows for all of us. And I think they are our friends. I think the saints are a living reality of God among us. And I will be very honest that I would have never understood how a saint operates, how God operates in his saints, into the Word, if I would never engage in this charitable work. Now, I also have to mention that the charitable work I do and I lead, it's a charitable work that we try to keep it close to the Bible, meaningly nobody's paid in this charity. So everybody is volunteer. And I think that makes the outcome of it much more valuable and more meaningful, because you don't do something, and if you do something, if you expect something in extent, you are out immediately limiting the beauty of this transcendent and the beauty of the love of God that grace has for all of us. When you put that reward into the picture, and you want the reward, like many, that was actually of me a struggle to understand when I dealt with our volunteers the first 5 years, because I could never understand why their motivation was not the same like my motivation. And they don't need it to be the same, but they needed to be allowed and explain the space that this is how this will be, and this is how it will remain. And because it was and it remained like this led to many miracles that many of us that we humbly embrace this vision and this cause were able to see with our worldly, devastated, sinful existence. And when you see these miracles in front of your eyes, you start wonder. So then maybe is this what I need to do now? Is this what I'm called to do? And mergingly into this, gradually everything kind of merges and becomes a harmonious unity. The academic presentations with the dissertations, with the helping 1,000 people in need, orphan in Romania, which we are able to help to this humble work, and to the incredible accomplishments that happen from a small group of people that just get together to do something good. And I think we are going to reach 1 million in donations at 10 years, which is next year. How does this happen? If you ask me, how does this happen? I don't know how does this happen. It just ends up happening. The other part that I would like to emphasize is that please stop by our booth over there. We do have a booth in the. Probably you saw it. We have a booth. I'm gonna pass this around. There is a big, and this is the brochure. You can pass it around. Right?
Do we have time for a few questions?
Yeah. So you stop by the booth and you can see. Then we can talk more at private level about this. But then we have time now for some questions, if you may, and I would be happy to address those.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your.
Thank you.
So we welcome our second paper presenter today. The title is On Inner and Outer Restoration, Correct Communion as a Therapy for Isolation and Violence. There is hope and work to do, says St. Theophan the Recluse. Our presenter is Imad Rubeiz, who is a PhD candidate and also an assistant accreditation officer and lecturer at the University of Balaman. Did I say that correctly?
Very good.
He's also a chanter at Our Lady of Balaman Patriarchal Monastery in Balaman, El Qura, Lebanon. So we're delighted that Ahmed has come this far. Again, you were here with us last year.
Yeah,
so we're delighted to
that's-
have him back and to hear his paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, allow me first to thank everyone to be here present, and allow me also to mention something that triggered the whole paper, and therefore my second presentation in OCAMPR. Last year when the management brought up the theme, well, somehow something triggered in my mind that I have read those words in this sequence: violence, communion. It made me go back to the books that I once read in the past, and I came across that of Saint Theophan the Recluse. Well, somehow there's one of his books which is actually a compilation of the letters he used to send to one of his spiritual daughters. And in this conversation, this back and forth, he actually addressed the theme of this particular conference in that order. And that led me to reread that whole compilation, that whole book, ending up in summarizing it in those 10 pages. That's how I ended up coming back again here. Otherwise, I wouldn't have something new to offer. So that's about it. Of course, the 10-page presentation, I don't think I have sufficient time to read it all, but then hopefully it will be published and anyone who is interested can again read it. The saint's knowledge of the human soul seems very clear. A versed reader in psychology will immediately realize the extent to which Saint Theophan understands the depth of the psychological and emotional fragility of the human being. Well, at a time before modern psychology spoke of this issue. Saint Theophan has successfully developed a perfect methodology in presenting almost every spiritual pearl teaching found in Orthodox spirituality. By reading the 80 chapters, the letters back and forth, that culminated into his spiritual life, the title of the book, it becomes evident how deeply rooted he was in St. John Climacus, the ladder of divine ascent, as well as in the teachings and wisdom of all the Desert Fathers. He taught and led by example. He surely implemented the teachings of the Holy Fathers, first in his own spiritual struggles, only then daring to offer such help to his contemporary God-seekers, to whom he presented himself as rather a fellow traveler than a guide, the very words of the saint. A word of caution, even from our saint himself. Contemporary readers, you, I, might be tempted to romanticize the lives and achievements of previous centuries' Orthodox ascetics. This would technically be equivalent to idolizing them. The Holy Fathers have always warned against this, as it is a forbidden practice in the scriptures. For as John Chrysavgis stated, the ascetics are not idols of supreme powers, but icons of sublime love. Hence, when the therapy of the person is undertaken, it's evident that the saint abides by the guiding rule, always consult your elder. As Chrysavgis puts it, the objective is twofold. On one side, learn not to depend on others, and on the other, grow an independence from one's own self and or relying on it. Yet, there's no one uniform way to achieve this. For Saint Theophan, this starts with obedience to the parents at home when we were still young. Remember, the ear of the contemporary human being rejects the mere sound of obedience. Do I have to obey? This. However, we have to struggle, for we cannot achieve harmony in our inner self without some form of it. Why struggle? Briefly, it touches one major contemporary problem, our own pride. We humans readily accept that we are sinners, that we have iniquities. Even St. John Climacus acquires that fornicators can be healed by people. Those who are fallen from the grace can be helped by angels and saints. But those who are overcome by pride can only be helped by God. Nothing can be done much about that. The topic of this present paper is to shed light on how Saint Theophan the Recluse has understood the contemporary man's confusion, which is the violence in this matter, or at least leads to it, as it results of his isolation, a typical status of the human being after the fall. This has led man is used here as the entire human person, to break his original communion with God. Restoration, therapy, takes place by entering once more into communion with God, and the cycle is complete. To understand why isolation within an individual takes place and how in turn this leads to an inner violence, a mark of miscommunion or lack of communion, St. Theophan describes a circular relation between what happens within the individual, the inner self, and outside of him, the outer self. He analyzes the whole individual soul and its entities along with what surrounds and affects him. St. Theophan makes a clear distinction between three aspects of the soul. In the mental part, the yearning for the ideal in the soul appears from the action of the spirit. In this active part, it is from the action of the soul, the will, that there appear desire for and production of unselfish deeds for virtues. In the sensual part of the soul, there appears a yearning and love for the beautiful. The saint uses an ascetic terminology that a contemporary reader can still understand. He was successful in transmitting the inheritance of the Desert Fathers' literature and applying it to the dynamics of spiritual direction, counseling. In contradiction with man-made techniques on how one can achieve inner balance in everyday life, techniques that have missed to intensify the role of struggle, be it spiritual or otherwise, St. Theophan stresses that passions are not natural to us, but alien, and that the emotions of the heart are agitated by these very passions. In the world, everything is presented as apparently easy to obtain, a self-delusion, soul-destroying, that the distracting beauties willingly trip us into. In a simple analysis, our saint shows how cunning the enemy is. He first tries to push any person who is tempted, into the whirlpool. That is, first of all, he enters into the realm of thoughts. Beneath these thoughts, he kindles passionate desires, and with this he agitates the heart. A person whom temptation has ripened is led to this point. If he does not come to his senses, he falls. After he has fallen, he is drawn into a whirlpool of turbulent motion of thoughts, desires, and emotions. Part 1. Out of communion. How the problem first arises and continues to arise. A sequence. A fact that always takes place. From looking every day at the world, we realize that many have inner confusion and disorderliness. The saints turn for isolation, which in turn leads to violence. This setting was not seeded in man at creation, but after creation, when our commandment transgressing ancestors have transferred this now damaged seed to their descendants, therefore to us. Although not natural to us, we have received the seed at birth. It is not in our nature, in the sense that without it, it is not that man is no more a human being. On the contrary, without it, a human being becomes a true human being. We are drawn to becoming that person after all. Remember that our inner confusion and disorderliness are both innate in us, but not natural in us. Actually, they are a burden to our true nature. In other words, after the fall, although our nature, parts and substance remained the same in us, we are still flesh, bones, and whatnot, functioning under the same laws and needs, yet our consciousness did not freely set out in the same direction. When God breathed into our face the breath of his life, and as such gave us our spirit, he gave us with it a power. For a God-fearing individual back then, still living in communion with God, man's spirit gave her power to control soul and body, as well as everything that's outside of her. This is the original condition of man. When the living communion with God was disrupted, the flow of divine power was also disrupted. Instead of ruling the body and soul, the spirit became ruled by them. The intellect ruled over man, and through it, corporeality. Hence, man became intellectual and carnal, i.e., constant need of tangible corporeality. That's a concept that has been addressed quite many times in this particular meeting, today and yesterday. Man ended up having the same spirit as before, however, now without authority. We don't have much authority over it. Man feels it during God-fearing instances, alarms of the conscience, and occasionally when dissatisfied with some worldly things. Man could no more see the true perspective of things, nor properly keep his needs and desires. Hence, confusion entails. Man became internally torn into pieces. He became violent, both internally and externally. This is what illness consists of. The spirit became conceited and self-willed. St. Theophan analyzes in details what happens for such a man. The worldly life of the contemporary fallen man is primarily characterized by pride, also called egoism, Life presents itself to him as a primary goal. Thus, everyone's goal becomes to impose their desires on someone else or to bind him by them. You have quite accurately called this tyranny. No matter how well someone conceals his desires, behind them stands egoism, which desires to twist you to its needs. He's addressing his spiritual daughter. That's where the you and thing comes. Or to use you as its means. Thereon, the person shuts himself up in his own shell and becomes unable to produce any warmth, a clear break in inner and outer communion, both with God and with her fellow human being. By turning inwards, Saint Theophan analyzes what the spiritual, mental, and physical aspects of the man are. The body incorporates three major systems, each made of many organs, each having certain needs and carrying out its functions. First, the digestive system's needs are alimentary, corporeal, to eat. Food, drink, air, sleep. Its function is nourishment. Two, the musculoskeletal system's need is to tense the muscles. Its function is inner and outer movement. Three, the nervous system with the head at its center, the spinal cord, and the system of ganglia with the radicals of nerves that pass through the entire body has at its need the pleasant stimulation of the nerves of the entire body, such as the regulation of warmth and cold and the like, and especially the pleasant stimulation of the five senses. Its function is therefore sensory. It tackles the senses. Overall, when the operation of these functions and their interrelationship is in order, the body is healthy and life is not endangered. But when this order is upset, the body becomes sick and life is endangered. Although it would seem that these bodily concerns are different from the soul and that the soul has nothing to do with them, one should note, though, that the soul has the closest contact with the body. As both are intertwined, stresses St. Theophan, the needs of the former are also to be considered the latter's needs as well. This renders the soul desire to make the body comfortable in every way possible. This one-sided relationship has its origin an inner compulsion, as the saint calls it, a sort of an instinctual creature love for the body and desire to maintain the comfort of this body. The sum total of all this comprises the physical aspect of the human life. Understandably, not everything here is equally physical, carnal, or sensual. In fact, only the digestive system is strongly carnal, while the organs involved in the movements and feelings are primarily mental, not bodily. Uniquely, the tongue is an organ exclusively of the soul, which alone it is intended to serve. Morally speaking, when the person becomes extremely attracted by things related to food, his or her body makes its primary goal the bodily comfort and gratification of such physical needs, forgetting about the mental ones, and much less the spiritual ones. In such an event, each physical need naturally and simply links itself to a diversity of other needs inculcated by habit. The soul, on the other hand, is always in motion. It cannot stand on one thing. Its motion is divided into three categories: thoughts, intellect; desires, senses. At the intellectual level, not every aspect of its is chaotic motion. For amidst thoughts, there are the following three substantial operations. At the moment a person observes in themselves something through their senses, or hear about how others observe something in theirs, the person's imagination would be imagining, and their memory remembering, for nothing enters the soul without these two. Although a person could have thoughts that spring up directly from the soul itself, all mental activity is based on imagination and memory. B. The motion of the thought itself comes out of the soul and operates by its laws. Note that the imagination and the memory do not think. They are unskilled labored force, the backbone. The faculty of the soul from which arises such questions and the thoughts that are sought and born in answer to them is called the intellect, the words of the saint, whose business is to reason, think over things, and reach the necessary conclusions. Third part, while thinking something definite over, affirms Saint Theophan, there is still no clearly defined thought. Your intellect compares with past categorized information and tries to come up with answers as to what the new thing is, what it does, etc. Once the matter is resolved and you are satisfied with an answer, whereby by your thoughts or by agreeing with someone else's thought, your intellect turns to something else and the obtained answer goes to your mental archive, the memory. Note that the person's intellect is always above memory and imagination. The intellect, along with intellectual labor, gets you definite concepts or cognitions about things. Of course, in an attempt to come up with anything definite, people think and think, yet many questions remain unanswered. This yields opinions, suppositions. Obviously, not all people can become scientists or even study sciences, yet everyone can and should discuss the things surrounding them in order to obtain definite concepts about them. This is how the intellectual faculty works or should work, as we have seen. The problem, therefore, arises when there is a continual motion of the images, notions without any definite purpose of order. Thoughts. Every second, thoughts bombard us. Thoughts simply spring up and form a line, intersecting occasionally, go forward at times, backward at others, however, never stopping. This is not reasoning. It is wandering and scattering thoughts. Therefore, this state is the complete opposite of what the intellectual faculty is supposed to be. That is its illness. As St. Theophan analyzes, we often get lost in thought. The thought goes to the archive, the memory, and together with the imagination, it sorts through all the rubbish that already exists there. At that point, it tries to make sense of the new information based on the past, from which it takes meaningful and meaningless material, experience outcomes, or new ones never tried before. This is very similar to dreaming. As to the desirous level, it is the aspect that wills, that has a will. The faculty that desires everything God, nothing contrary or unpleasant. It's the active power of the person. Its essential need is to live and function. St. Theophan described this work as it maintains under its supervision all power of the soul and body and all functions which are at its disposal which it uses on need basis. It is moved by zeal, thirst for something, and it is stimulated by whatever pleasant, beneficial, and necessary. He furthers, our saint, that analytically it is always desires that become evident, not the underlying needs. So it's not whether we as human beings need something for reality, it's how we desire the need or not that makes it different. The soul has a choice to make. With choice comes a decision. With decision, means are selected, a method is defined, and the procedure for carrying out choice, decision, and means are then undertaken from previous acts. When a person's way of life is known, one may anticipate his or her thinking or behavior. What regulates such active life is prudence, the same as reason. However, this one serves the will. In any individual, it is natural and correct for the will's work to determine the way, method, and measure of satisfaction of the desires, whether stemming from the needs or actually replacing them in order to make life a smooth flow. In a healthy individual, this leads to peace and joy. However, every individual's aforementioned four aspects do not manifest in every person in the same way or intensity, thus leading to the sickness. In the mental aspect, we have confusion, scattering, wandering of thoughts. In the desiring aspect, we have inconsistency, disorder, selfish desires. How much time we spend in idleness and futility. We wander here and there, not knowing why we do such a thing. Hence, since desires are always born, one cannot control them. The result, give me, I want. In such a sick individual, desires will include anger, hate, envy, stinginess, vanity, pride, and the like. The natural need of the family and social life, which have been established, must be the source of such desires. Nothing is natural in any of these things. They only confuse what is natural and orderly in life. A clear recipe for an individualistic and isolated individual. Now comes the role of the sensual aspect, with at its center the heart. As St. Theophan already introduced, everything that enters the soul from outside and is shaped by the intellectual and active aspects goes into the heart. That is why it is duly considered as the center of life. The heart consistently senses the soul and body condition along with the diverse impressions from the individual actions of the soul and body, from surrounding objects which it encounters, from the outward situation, from everything that surrounds us. Hence, everything is ultimately reflected in the heart. Language itself has no words to express the unique feelings every influence on the heart produces. Functionally, the heart maintains the energy of the soul and body. Even zeal, the motive force of the will, springs from this organ. Satisfying the heart's desires ultimately leads to a calm individual, a sweet calm, the very words of Saint Theophan, thus constituting its own measure for every happiness that nothing disturbs. Once again, not every person puts his heart equally in the same things. I wish something, you wish something else, your heart is in some direction, yours is in a different one. A healthy individual always maintains mental vigilance and prudent behavior, thus minimally having to face unpleasant matters to his heart. However, in reality, the mental part often opens up to idle dreams and distractions, leading also the active part to deviate from its normality, thus becoming enticed by inconsistent desires that are not needs of nature, but alien passions. Look how anger consumes the heart, how hatred tears it, how evil grinds, how many disturbances and torments cause discontent or disgraceful conceit, how heavy lies grief when pride suffers. These evil passions, when they are satisfied, give joy, but it is short-lived. This is a full quotation from the saint. When passions start affecting us, our heart ceases to indicate reliably our state. Every sense becomes distorted. Every force takes us to the wrong direction. One becomes doomed to any uncertainty, at which point, pushed by sweet desires and carnal and sensual pleasures, such individuals always fall into sensuality, but they are beneath the feature which distinguishes man from any other living creature. Thus, St. Theophan has described the soul as its noetic faculty, accurately telling what would make the person healthy through his or her inner and outer communion. In his analysis, St. Theophan has clearly identified how alienation, individualism, hence isolation, and violence eventually arise in the individual as a chain reaction. After all, how different from a violent being one becomes when led by his or her own passions, alienating him or her from communion at both the inner level, therefore with God, and the outer level with other people. In such case, is there any makeover, any redemption, any way of this pit of hell? Well, yes, he offers a solution, and he calls that into communion. For the restoration of our spirit and its reunion with God, says St. Theophan, it is necessary that the divine spirit descends to it and revive it. That is the reason the only begotten Son of God became man, suffered and died on the cross, was resurrected and ascended to heaven. Of course, he then requested the Holy Spirit to continue this work as he informed his disciples. One must understand that the production of divine communion is brought about by the grace of the Holy Spirit. This divine spirit, assures our saint, acts in secret on our spirit and sets it in motion. Once in motion, our own spirit recognizes thought, its natural divine knowledge within, that God exists, maintains everything, and is the rewarder. The consciousness of this makes the person fully dependent on God, holding in himself his fear. Both the fear of God and feeling hopeless without God's help render the person to understand, where shall I go? Where shall I run to? He then understands God's wrath on the unrighteous people in Romans 1:18, at which point comes the good news that the gospel brings. Why run anywhere? Simply come under the protection of the cross and be saved. Therefore, heeding the good news of our Lord's salvation, our spirit starts doing all its best, happily and willingly, in order to become a partaker of gospel blessings. Such a disposition of our souls makes it ready for divine communion and the grace of the Holy Spirit. Through the means of a sacrament, the believer repents, is baptized, receives the gift of the Holy Spirit. This is the very action of divine communion, living and active, as the saint tells us. In this process, not everything is accomplished solely by the divine spirit. We, too, are expected to do something, and an important one about this. The good news tells us it is from God. It tells us where to begin. This is when God stops. Now it's up to our consent and free will. St. Theophan gives an analogy, the incident of St. Paul the Apostle preaching in Areopagus. St. Dionysius and some of his disciples immediately followed the apostle, while others asked him to come again to preach some other time, so they deferred their attention. Hence, it is indeed up to us to put our consent, without which God would have saved us a long time ago in an instant. Note that the Spirit, once having felt the urgency of the situation and that the good news has indicated the way out, one must feel hopeless without God and consciously feel guilty of everything and repents of it. At that point, the person should accept to be saved in the very form of salvation that will be offered to him, her, and do that cheerfully. St. Theophan thus identifies clearly by that the synergy that completes the cycle between man's free will and consent and the work of God. Without that cycle, no salvation, no restoration is possible. Well, that's the briefing. Now the details. St. Theophan maintains that holding a steady spiritual life as a mode of existence will hence be the pathway of restoration. But how does one put such an advice into practice? As stated earlier, after the fall, the soul's entire devotion is to structure our earthly temporal existence and delight well in it. Its knowledge is built on experience, its activity on gratifying temporal needs, and its senses are endangered, and they persist only from its visible states and conditions. This is all true of the soul. However, some things, points out St. Theophan, occur at a higher level than the soul. These are guests which drop in from a higher realm, the realm of the spirit. But what is the spirit? How does he define the spirit? The spirit is that force which God breathed into man when he created him. Humans have a soul that anyway surpasses incomparably that of animals. The spirit breathed by God combines with the soul and raises it above every non-human soul. Hence, as a force that comes from God, the spirit knows God, seeks God, and in him alone finds rest. It depends completely on him and acknowledges itself as obliged to pleasing God in everything and living only for him and by him. In parallel to the soul, the movements of the spirit have three manifestations: the fear of God, the conscience, and the longing for God. In all matters, people have elaborated different ways to profess the existence of a supreme being, God, who created everything and maintained everything. And such is the natural credo, which is inscribed by the Spirit. By such a confession, the Spirit venerates God and is filled with his fear. As to conscience, God has imparted to the soul a particle of his omniscience in the natural credo he established. After that, he inscribed in it the requirements of his holiness, truths, and benevolence. This is why we are tempted, attracted by sanctity, because we have that spirit in us, put in us right from the beginning. It's up to the soul to implement them, becoming itself the judge of what is right, what is wrong. As such, by virtue of God's natural codex, the function of the conscience is legislation. It guards the law, being both judge and executor, says St. Theophan. The conscience leads therefore the person to honor and pray to God, believing in a future life in which one receives according to his or her deeds. The spirit is exactly this force that holds all such beliefs and convictions together. 3. Note that the spirit comes from God. It seeks God. It wants to taste him. It rests in him. Only by attaining this that the spirit becomes in a state of peace. Earthly blessings bring only incomplete comforts. They are insatiable, for as one realizes, as soon as one attains something corporeal, he or she casts it aside and starts searching for the next, one thing after the other. That is chaos, the word that he uses. Still, the human soul makes us a little above animals and the spirit a little below angels. Thence, there is in each human being some longing for God, expressed in the universal yearning for the supreme good, and is more clearly seen also in the universal dissatisfaction with everything created. The force of the Spirit is what draws the person from the visible to the invisible, from the temporal to the eternal, from the creation to the Creator. That force may be weaker in some persons. It may even pervert the requirement of the spirit, but it is not possible to utterly suppress it or annihilate it. In fact, the soul aspires to the above. This is apparent in all the soul's three aspects of life: the intellectual, the mental, the active, and the sensual. Examining this aspiration in a healthy individual will let us see that, 1. In the mental part, every action that the soul does indicates its yearning for the ideal. Nothing satisfies it. It always looks up to the higher, seeking to define the significance of each sphere of things in the overall sum of creation. It seems hence that the spirit, by creation, and because of its divine likeness, intends to contemplate all things in God. The soul would be doing specifically this if there had been no fall. The active part, i.e. in terms of the behavior, Saint Theophan, the active part, the thing that we can do as human beings to restore this whole setup. Saint Theophan claims that the soul desires and produces unselfish deeds, virtues, and always aspires for such virtues. The soul then has to work to establish a good temporal living condition for man to live in. This is done through the person's will. Again, this force is not equal in all people. For some people are ready to sacrifice all comforts of life, living in renunciation of everything. Well, ascetics are a good example of those. For others, this is not possible. Yet, because the soul is bound to the spirit, and because it knows about such a life, it is principally drawn by it and works on introducing such a majestic life to itself, to the soul, making whatever necessary changes in it to reach for its aspiration. In the sensual part, the senses, the five senses, there is a yearning and love for the beautiful, the intellectual, contemplative beauty, hence the ideal beauty. This yearning originates first because of the spirit, which knows God, comprehends divine beauty, and seeks to delight in it alone. This is evident by the fact that the spirit always shows what it is not. Earthly things that are created, never satiated. Contemplation of God is what would delight the spirit and forms its life. This is a paradisal life. Communion between soul and spirit hence becomes evident. Sorry. To understand further this form of communion, St. Theophan elaborates on the supremacy of the spiritual life. Spiritual life exists in 5 degrees or layers, as he calls them. 1. The spiritual intellectual. 2. The exclusively intellectual. 3. Intellectual physical. 4. The observations of the intellectual physical combined with imagination and memories, along with desires that spring up from physical needs and sensations of bodily conditions and impressions. And 5. The physical. In other words, states St. Theophan, a person leads his life either spiritually, with spiritual views, habits, feelings, or it is carnal, with carnal thoughts, deeds, feelings. When someone lives primarily by the spiritual, and this is rare to find, that person does not err. Why? First and foremost, because spiritually is the very norm of the original human life. So leading a spiritual life signifies the person is full, is real. Second, there will always be some intellectual and carnal needs that the person needs to attend to continually, however, keeping them in subordination to the spirit. Hence, a simple God-fearing person is actually superior to whomever is different but does not have the pleasing of God among his or her goals. Living by spirit will actually define true happiness of the God-fearing person as compared to the temporal happiness of the non-God-fearing person. Conclusion. It's hence evident that man, after the fall, nourishes his heart either from the world, along with its fallen passions, or from the spirit that in turn is in communion with the Holy Spirit. One reaches miscommunion, communication, discommunion, whatever you want to call it, when he or she continuously listens to his or her own carnal and intellectual needs, our own thought, to the point that she indulges in their satisfaction more than minding the spiritual realm and its needs. Miscommunion is in fact expressed in the isolation that man lives, which leads him to be violent, whether towards himself, towards God and his relation with him, and hence towards his fellow human beings. The antidote as expresses our saint, is to live the real meaning of asceticism, since it incorporates what the Holy Fathers have named nepsis, vigilance. Real asceticism, obviously not restricted only to monks and nuns, some may misinterpret the deep and true definition of this concept, leads to the purification of the person, a synergy that combines man's will and actual behavior to live by the spirit of the divine energy of God that purifies, illuminates, and then deifies, becomes the recipe for healing. The person restores the true meaning of living healthily, leading a spiritual life that balances the heart, intellect, thoughts, and body. Thank you.